If you used a summon to beat a boss, you did not beat the game, you cheated! If you're not unfamiliar with the Souls-like community, the sentence I just read must have triggered some Vietnam flashbacks in you. Throughout the entirety of Souls games' history, there has always been a sort of controversy surrounding the use of summons and cheese tactics in the games. Being a franchise recognized for its unforgiving difficulty and brutality for newcomers and even veterans alike, it is not uncommon to stumble upon those gifted, selected few that manage to conquer and beat the game in the most challenging way possible. That would be beating it by themselves and without any kind of cheese, but not without leaving their skid marks on Reddit, Steam, and other forums, letting everyone know of their impressive feat of focus and skill. And with the arrival of Elden Ring, it was no wonder that the tradition would surface yet again from its diarrhea pond to infest every possible corner of the internet. Of course, we also have the word of those who defend the mechanics and cheese strats and claim that if it's part of the game, then it's valid to use, and therefore it would be valid to claim that you did indeed beat the game. But who is right in this case? Is there really a correct way to beat Elden Ring? Does summoning and cheese strats truly hinder the game experience? Let's take a deep dive into this whole drama and see what conclusion we can make out of it, my little Big Macs. In the much more simpler era of 2011, we saw with the arrival of Dark Souls the introduction to the summoning mechanic for the vast majority of the player base. This mechanic was already present in Demon Souls, but since that title was exclusive for PS3 and Dark Souls was multi-platform, a lot of people were just basically experiencing the mechanic for the first time. For those of you who don't know how summoning worked, you basically had the bee in human form and use an item called White Sign Soapstone to leave a sign on the ground which other players could interact with. Whenever some player interacted with that summon sign, you would be summoned to their world to help them clear the area and defeat the area boss. In the same fashion, you were able to look for signs and summon other players to help you, with a maximum of 2 helpers per session. This is what is commonly known as co-op, to prevent the game from becoming too easy by summoning a max-level Yakuza to your low-level game. The level range in which you could summon players was limited. The range would depend on your level and would be based on a simple formula. Back in the day, this did not take into account the level of your weapon, so you could still summon someone who was within your level range but with a maxed-out weapon. To sort of balance this out, the health of bosses would be increased depending on the amount of players in the session. The more players in the session, the chunkier the boss would get. Of course, this was not nearly enough to compensate for 3 players attacking one enemy at the same time. To top it off, the buff did not include regular mobs in the game, so coursing through areas while doing co-op was certainly much easier. Dark Souls 2 introduced an item used to enhance the matchmaking called Name Engraved Ring. With this ring equipped, you could choose one of the multiple gods to engrave the ring with to act as some sort of matchmaking password. This would increase the summoning range in which you could summon other players. So it was useful if you wanted to play with a friend. Just pick the same god as them and you were good to go. Dark Souls 2 also increased the limit of co-op phantoms per session up to 3, so you could form parties of up to 4 players. You can imagine that the enemies of the game could hardly keep up with this. As an additional feature, Dark Souls 2 had the small white sign soapstone. The difference between this soapstone and the normal one was that you were summoned not as a phantom, but as a shade. Being a shade meant that you were summoned only for a limited time, but you could be summoned in areas where the boss was dead, something that was not possible in Dark Souls 1. The small soapstone had a wider summoning range than the normal soapstone too, so even after defeating the area boss, people could still summon help to explore the areas. For Dark Souls 3, we got for the first time the password matchmaking system, the bane of every invader and soul elitist in existence. With this system, you could summon anyone that was using the same password as you, regardless of soul level or weapon level. The game's way of balancing this was to scale down the phantom you summoned and have them deal reduced damage and have reduced HP. Sadly, this was implemented in the most incompetent way possible, and it was pretty common to see max-level unscaled phantoms running around with the host of a world. You can imagine that this completely trivialized the PvE in some cases. Not to mention that over-leveled phantoms could also drop the host endgame weapons, gear, and rings. That's talismans for you, making the experience even easier for them. For Elden Ring, the password matchmaking system was kept and it functions more or less like in Dark Souls 3, with the difference that enemy mobs now also scale with phantoms. But a new mechanic was introduced for those who didn't want to engage in online shenanigans. You see, in previous entries, if you wanted to co-op but you either didn't like playing online or didn't have access to it, you had to resort to summoning some of the NPC characters that were scattered through the game. These NPC summons usually served as damage sponges, because they would have massive health bars, sometimes while also dealing massive damage to the boss too. However, these were few and far between, so they would not always be available for help. But in Elden Ring, aside from NPC summons, the new mechanic that somewhat replaced them was the Spirit Ashes. Spirit Ashes basically worked as pocket NPC summons that you could summon whenever a prompt appeared on the left of the screen. To summon them, you had to use the spirit calling bell that I gave you at the start of your journey with the ashes of some long-forgotten warrior. This would summon the spirit of said warrior to aid you in battle, and when maxed out, the spirit would have massive amounts of HP, pretty much like old NPC summons. Of course, not every spirit ash is super good, but some are incredibly strong. The strongest are Black Knife Tishay, due to her ability of inflicting destined death, which deals percentage health damage, and Mimic Tear. This last spirit would copy the build you were using the moment you summoned it. And if your build was strong or broken, Mimic Tear could basically solo bosses for you. Mimic Tear was in fact so strong that it actually received a nerf, becoming the only spirit ash to be nerfed in Elden Ring's history. It would be extremely disingenuous to even suggest that summoning does not reduce the game's difficulty in any way. The increase in numbers on the player's side give an extreme advantage that is not balanced by merely giving the mobs and bosses more health. Enemies can be both stun-locked and stance-broken, so it doesn't matter if the mobs have 4 times more health, they can still be stun-locked into oblivion without giving them any chance to attack. Furthermore, by summoning 2 over-leveled phantoms, a host can just opt to leave the PvE entirely to them and be completely carried from beginning to end while doing only the bare minimum or nothing at all. And all of this while maybe also receiving from them weapons, armor, talismans, ashes of war, items and more. And as showcased in a previous video of Waifu, password summons are also a huge problem for invaders due to them not being downscaled properly. So much so that even an inexperienced host should not fear invaders while hiding behind his over-leveled babysitters. An invader has a lot of trouble fighting over-leveled phantoms because these deal more damage, deal more status effect infliction, and have more natural defenses than the average invader. Spirit Ashes might not be as strong as player summons, but they work pretty well as both damage sponges and distractors for the player. It is much easier to deal with a boss or a group of enemies that are focusing something else other than you. So long story short, yes, summoning does decrease the game's difficulty. That's undeniable. However, aside from the unhealthy PvP experiences that may come out of invading groups of players, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with summoning help. Do I think, however, that summoning 2 or 3 guys to drop items for you and do all the heavy lifting hinders your game experience? Well, to be honest, yes, it will trivialize and hinder your first playthrough, which is supposed to be the most memorable one. But if someone wants to have 2 friends beat the game for them, while they merely tag along for the ride or find the cheesiest tactics online to beat bosses with ease, there's nothing anyone can do about it. It is their game, and they can have the experience they want.
Ouchie.
Those angry orcs on forums can argue that these people might be missing out on the experience, or that they won't enjoy the game in the intended way to do so. But are those arguments out of legit concern for those people? Or do they say it just because they want to fuel their egos by thinking they're better than other gamers? Regardless of what their reasoning might be, in no way, shape or form can they force or shame anyone into having the same experience as them. They can only give suggestions, and it's up to the other person to listen to them or not. Because if people were to take these angry apes seriously, where would it end, huh? Where do we draw the line? Because we can always go lower. No summoning, no upgrading, no leveling, no healing, no magic, no incantations, no items, no dodging, no blocking, no talismans, no armor, no weapons, no running, no jogging, no attacking, no moving, and we can go on and on until the end of times. The point is the same as the last time. Let people play however they want and mind your own business. What they do in their own PvE game is their problem. If they hinder their experience or enjoy it or whatever, that's entirely on them. Because sadly, at the end of the day, the intended way to play is the one you make for yourself. And if you cheese the game to be able to beat it and you're watching this video right now, I don't really share that sentiment, but more power to you, bro. There's nothing wrong with cheesing your game. Just don't be like that pestering part of the community that denies cheesing in spite of clearly having cheesed. And that to top it off, shame other players for struggling with the game. Yes, that part of the community filled with glob-gloggob-galabs also exists. You literally cannot escape those large pustules. They are everywhere. F*** cheaters, though.